Good morning, everyone. I wanted to take the opportunity to record some of these videos that we'll be using for adult faith formation, to record them perhaps ahead of time so that at least over the next coming weeks we'll have some access to some programming, regardless of what happens with regard to our restrictions on meeting. I thought it'd be a good idea to go ahead and try to continue the programming the best way we can, which in this case is probably going to be just by straight video delivery. So this is actually going to go back and touch upon what we were supposed to do last week, which was examining the life of St. Thomas, the Apostle, as we continue our series about, and from them he chose 12, the apostolic age. So I'd like to share some of my thoughts about that, some of what I was going to plan to teach on for last week. We were supposed to already have been off for this coming Sunday, which March 22nd, which was for spring break, and then we were going to resume the following Sunday with an examination of Judas Iscariot. So my plan is to continue to try to do that really the best way that we can. So to follow up on this little video that I sent you that Bishop Barron shared, his thoughts about faith and reason, you'll notice that there were direct references to probably the most famous gospel passage we have about St. Thomas, which is from John's Gospel, that Bishop Barron commented on. And so I'd like to share some of my thoughts about that, to place that in not just the broader context of what we're trying to do here with this series, but also perhaps to place it in a little bit of a historical framework as well. Some things that we understand about St. Thomas. Although little is actually recorded about his life, about Thomas the Apostle, who's also known, by the way, as Didymus, which means the twin. More about that in a minute. But we know very little about him. And as we've talked about with regard to at least several others of these apostolic figures, perhaps with the exception of Peter, who we do know a good bit about. I made the point, for instance, when we discussed St. Bartholomew, that it seems to me that we know so little about these men that their personalities are really sort of become secondary to the role that they play in the church. And I think the more I've reflected on that, I think that might be by design, that their personalities really are secondary. That we know so little about them actually speaks to the profound nature of their role in the early church. So again, I think that may be by design, that we know so little about them. It's a good reminder, I think, maybe to us even, to keep in mind that perspective keeps us, I think, in the right relationship about who we are in God's big plan. That we too, our lives and our personalities are secondary really to what God has in store for each one of us and how we work into his master plan. So however little we might know about St. Thomas the Apostle, John's Gospel tells us something that is perhaps clearer to us than any of the rest, with the possible exception of St. Peter, who we know a good bit more about. We know that Thomas was not a fisherman. Thomas was a builder. And therefore, when you see him represented in either any kind of visual art, whenever you see him represented, sometimes he's holding a square, a builder's square, or architect's square, as we might call it today. And often he is, of course, depicted with the instrument of his martyrdom, which is a spear. So you usually see him in one of those two types of representations. Showing martyrs this way, by the way, is interesting. A question came up, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago from one of our discussions we had when we were still meeting face to face. This question came up about why is it that art does that? Why do we have representations of apostles and martyrs throughout history being always shown with the instruments of their passion? And I think that there's actually two ways to address that, two answers to that same question. One of them is practical and one of them is probably more theological. But the practical answer, I think, is quite simply that in early art, particularly in the Middle Ages and even into the High Middle Ages and beyond, people were literate about the saints. People were far more literate about them than many people are today, and it was a way of identifying them. You looked at, for instance, you looked at an image of St. Thomas and he's holding a spear, well then you immediately knew who he was. If you saw past an image, for instance, a mural or a painting or a fresco that had a St. Bartholomew, for instance, and you see his skin, then you knew it was St. Bartholomew. Same of St. Catherine and her wheel, and all of these other examples. So that's the practical answer to that. The theological answer, I think, and maybe the one that's more important for us to reflect on in this particular series particularly, is that to see a martyr depicted with the instrument of his martyrdom tells us something really important about victory. You see, that's a victory over that instrument. It's victory over death. It's actually the great promise that we all have of that victory over death one day. Embracing it, really. Embracing the very instrument that brought about their own glory. So, St. Thomas's feast day is celebrated on July 3rd. There is a little bit of background to that as well. On the old Roman calendar that was formalized in the 9th century, his feast day was actually on December 21st. And there are still people around the world, I think people who are more traditionalist, who perhaps still observe that day in some sort of a quiet way, maybe. But it was moved to July 3rd in 1969, and that is the day we mark it today. That actually, the July 3rd date, the reason I think that's kind of interesting is that it aligns actually far more closely with the tradition that was inherited by St. Jerome. His commentary on martyrology that he wrote in the 4th century, he actually identifies July 3rd as being the date that was associated with St. Thomas. So I think that's interesting. We tend to think about changing dates in the modern world that perhaps that doesn't necessarily reflect the tradition. And I would argue that many times it really does. It substantiates and perhaps even corrects an earlier practice. So in this case, July 3rd aligns very closely with what St. Jerome himself told us in the 4th century. I also think this might be a good time to make a follow-up point about something. A couple of people have asked about when the apostles that we're talking about, we talked about their feast days. So a couple of questions have come up about, well, when were they canonized? And I think that's a great question, and maybe underscores something we often just sort of take for granted. For them and for many of the saints of the early centuries of the church, there was no formal canonization process as we understand it today. The Congregation for the Causes of Saints did not exist as a bureaucracy, if you will, a congregation within the Roman Curia until the 16th century, when it was created, at least initially part of an office of liturgy and an office of the saints were created together in the 16th century. It was separated out in the next century by Pope Urban VIII. But there was no process the way that we know it today. So all of these apostles and all of these early martyrs were actually canonized by what we would call acclamation, by the early bishops, fathers, doctors of the church, who universally recognized them as saints because of their unique roles in the early church and obviously because of their martyrdom. So I think that's an important point to make. So let's talk about St. Thomas then, and in fact that we call him, probably the most famous reference we have for him is Doubting Thomas. And sometimes I think in our common usage, we say that almost like it's a negative. And we've all heard this, that don't be a doubting Thomas, as if there's something negative about this. It seems a little unfair to me. That's one of the things I really want to talk about, because to suggest that there's something inherently wrong with doubt, that there's something inferior about having doubt. You know, in the human condition, doubt is a part of our daily life. And to suggest that there's something inferior about that as a way of coming to knowledge, I think is unfair in the broadest spectrum of humanity, but particularly, maybe, perhaps especially, for St. Thomas. And let's talk about why that is. To say that there's something wrong with needing empirical proof is actually to deny one of the ways that God instilled in us, a way that we were created to know Him. And we have many ways of knowing Him, and that's just one of them. So to suggest that, I think, is a little bit dismissive of our own, the way that we are created. To be a skeptic is simply to say that one questions. It doesn't mean that there's an ultimate lack of belief. You don't have to naturally reach the conclusion. And obviously, if you know the story, you know that Thomas does believe. And so I think that's important to point out. So what I want to do for us is set the scene as described and then explore just a little bit about this particular way of knowing. Set the scene. First of all, St. Thomas appears in all of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's also, of course, in the Acts of the Apostles. But in the Gospel of John is where we have a particularly vivid scene for us. Thomas was not present when Jesus appeared to the other apostles immediately following the resurrection. He was not present in that moment at that time. And Thomas is, here's the word, incredulous to learn that the apostles have seen the risen Lord. He's incredulous to hear that news and not having witnessed it himself. So I hope you can see this, and if you can't, it's obviously it's on the brochure we have for adult faith formation this term. You can also find it easily online. This is Caravaggio's painting from 1602, very famous painting of St. Thomas, and it's called The Incredulity of St. Thomas. This is the moment that's described in that gospel scene that I want to share with you. Because what the gospel scene does is it speaks, I think, directly to a fundamental human design issue. I want to say this again because I want you to really get this. It's a fundamental human design issue. How do human beings, all of us, any of us, come to know anything with certainty? How do we come to know anything with certainty? There's a really fancy term for this that philosophers use that's called epistemology. And all that means is it's the study of knowing, or the study of ways of knowing. So a way of knowing knowledge, a way of coming to a conclusion about truth. Thomas's doubt, if we could truly call it that, okay? Thomas's doubt leads him to certain knowledge. It leads him to truth. It leads him to truth. Therefore, it is undoubtedly a pathway to understanding, and clearly part of the way Thomas himself was created by God. A design issue, as I said, a design issue with our humanity. So let's listen to that passage from the 20th chapter of John, okay? And then there's a couple of things I really want to dive into because I think these are important takeaways. So, Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples said to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger into the nail marks, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now a week later, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, although the doors were locked, stood in their midst, and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and bring your hand and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believe." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you come to believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. So I think there's some really important things to look at in that little passage. And not necessarily in their order of importance, except for this first one. I will say this. Jesus doesn't shame Thomas or rebuke him in any way. He simply asked him, have you come to believe because you have seen me? He's not rebuking Thomas. He doesn't give Thomas time to answer, but we could presume that Thomas might have answered this question, well, yes, I believe because I have seen. Jesus then says, and this is important, blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. Again, that's not putting down Thomas. That's not saying you are not blessed, Thomas, or any of the other apostles. Remember, maybe this refers specifically to us. We haven't seen, but we believe. The other apostles had seen him risen. So I think that there's something important we could take away about maybe Jesus is speaking to us. Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. So I think that's one important takeaway. And another thing I think we have to remember from Thomas's perspective is he only wants to experience what the other apostles have. Who wouldn't want that? Who among us wouldn't want that? To have that same experience of seeing him risen. Now, here's another, I think, extremely important point for us to take away from all of this. If we insist upon calling him doubting Thomas, well, okay then. What exactly did Thomas doubt? I don't read anywhere into this that what he doubts is the resurrection. I don't read that. What I read is that he doubts the testimony of others. And again, keeping that perspective that maybe all he wanted was to experience what the others had. And this could be a little glimpse into his personality. What he doubts is the testimony of others, not the testimony of the resurrection, not the testimony of the risen Lord himself. And it's not that Thomas is somehow not blessed. And I want to go through this again. Listen to this. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and bring your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believe. Jesus specifically invited him to touch, to see, so that he would not be unbelieving. Jesus wants to reach Thomas in the way that Thomas needed to know, the way that Thomas was hardwired to know. Thomas represents all of us when we are seeking the truth. Jesus simply knows that this is Thomas's way of knowing. There's that big word, epistemology, the way Thomas comes to knowledge, the way he comes to the truth, is uniquely his own. But we all have some of this in us. We all have one way of knowing or another that predominates over the other. For some of us, we need little evidence. For instance, for myself, I'm one of those people that if someone in authority or someone that I trust tells me something, I tend to believe it. I tend to accept it until certainly something might prove it otherwise. But I don't need a lot of empirical evidence. I'm much more, perhaps, my epistemology is perhaps more faith-based. I trust people. I trust those I know to be honest with me. And so if I hear the testimony of someone in authority, then I'm probably going to believe it until I am obviously given some testimony to the other. So others of us need more empirical type of evidence. We need to directly observe something. We need to see it for ourselves. That's not an invalid or inferior way. Like Thomas, some people need that. Jesus met him where he was. And I think that's the beauty of all of this, is that Jesus really met him where he was. He came after Thomas. and said, "See, do not be unbelieving, but believe." And here's the beautiful thing, I think, about all of this, is the evidence that we have of something that the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us in the prologue, that we all have the capacity to know God. We were all created with this great capacity to know God and therefore know the truth. And this is one of those capacities. This is one of the many ways that God gave us to know Him. However that needs to happen for us as individuals, however it needs to happen, God reaches us where we are with the unique way we know. And so I think that's a beautiful, beautiful takeaway from all of that. So the last thing I want to do here is to sort of touch a little bit upon some of the tradition associated with St. Thomas. There is, of course, a very strong tradition that St. Thomas went to India. And as a matter of fact, the early martyrologies of the church record that he was martyred in India, probably in about the year 72. The tradition that he, quote, preached in India is reported by a source that I've shared with you all along. We've talked about Eusebius of Caesarea and the early traditions that he shares in the 4th centuries. This is the tradition that's reported by St. Jerome in his Martyrology. It's the tradition that is compiled into that great text of the High Middle Ages we've talked about called the Golden Legend. The tradition is that he preached in India. This was widely spread throughout both Eastern and Western Christianity. St. Ambrose also writes about it. St. Augustine writes about it, although does not give us any kind of historical context. They are simply passing on the tradition. So I think this is really solid tradition. And what's more important is that if you go to that part of India today, the tradition is very obviously present there. The tradition that he was martyred for the faith somewhere on the west coast of southern India in an area called Kerala is very, very strong tradition there. A body of Christians still exist in that part of India that use a very ancient rite derived from a Syriac rite, very early rite in that liturgical language. Whether this church dates from the time of the apostle or came about perhaps a few centuries later is impossible to say. I can't tell you that from a truly historical perspective, what the historical record might say. But we know from the historical record, I find this kind of interesting, that one of the sources we have of a kind of a transitional period between the early to high Middle Ages. There's an important source, for instance, if you study British history or the history of the British Isles, there's something called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which is a pretty good history of the islands, but importantly gives us some framework for understanding what happens outside by way of the English record. For instance, King Alfred the Great, the first real king of England, was living in the 9th and late 9th century, 800s. There's a record that in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that he sent an expedition to India to establish relations with people, he says, quote, the Christians we already know to be there. So we're talking about the 9th century. It's known that there was an established community of Christians on the Indian subcontinent very, very early. And as I said, the tradition of St. Thomas is very, very strong. If you read those early fathers of the church, they all pass on the same martyrology, the same tradition of his martyrdom there. On the other hand, though, the relics of St. Thomas were recorded clearly. In a record, we know that they are in Edessa, Turkey, in the 4th century. There's a record of their transfer from Edessa to a little Greek island called Chios. That happened in the 13th century. And then they were transferred to where they are today in Italy the following century. So there's also, of course, a very, very strong tradition that the skull of St. Thomas today is actually in a monastery on the island of Patmos. So there's all this interesting intersection of tradition. We've talked about that in here before. Tradition, we're not referring to our deposit of faith or sacred tradition, but talking about what is historical. And then there is, of course, true history, what can be validated in the record itself. So you have an interesting confluence of all those things coming together that support the idea that St. Thomas did, in fact, go to India and probably was indeed martyred there. So that brings us back to kind of a major point that we've made about all of these apostles. And remember that an apostle is one who is sent. And so we've talked about where all of these apostles to this point, where they went, where they took the good news, where they were reported to be in those days after they saw the risen Lord, after the ascension of our Lord. The Acts of the Apostles is very helpful in many ways for us to understand the early church. But then we reach a point where the historical narrative, the straight record, for instance, as St. Luke records in Acts of the Apostles, that is a history book. But then we reach a point where the historical narrative ends. The record might be silent from history's perspective, but our tradition is quite beautiful and fills in those gaps for us about what became of the apostles. So I want to close this by drawing your attention back to this beautiful Caravaggio painting. And remember that Jesus' words to Thomas were not a rebuke. And that's what I think Caravaggio captures so beautifully in this particular image. It's not a rebuke. Do not be unbelieving, but believe. And I think that really is a beautiful reflection for all of us right now during this season of Lent as we draw ever closer to Holy Week and perhaps can begin to contemplate the passion of our Lord in a more tangible way, to see and touch his wounds. And there's a lesson here for all of us as we approach this coming season. So thanks everyone for watching this. I hope that Father Dwayne and I will be back after our spring break of March 22nd with another video where we can perhaps explore, again, in this format, delivering to you the only way we really can, which is by video right now, but to explore about the life of someone who was called, chosen to be among the 12, but a tragic, interesting story is that of Judas Iscariot. And so that's where we will pick up right after we finish our little spring break. Actually, I guess we have an imposed break upon us right now, but what I want to try to do is simply honor the schedule that we've published and try to do this the best way we can. So thanks for your patience, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you soon, hopefully very soon.